Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, welcome to Break the Backlog, the show where I sit down and provide my thoughts, opinions, and personal stories about a particular game that I've been playing. Today we're going to be talking about a game that has been suggested to me quite a bit over the years by my fellow JRPG lovers in the YouTube community, and that is Suikoden for the original PlayStation. My awareness of this game came from my early days of making YouTube videos a few years back when one of my good creator buddies, G.O.A.T, started this super relaxing series called Playing Suikoden While Waiting for Eiyuden Chronicle. This video series was one in which he released over 150 episodes of him playing through the first two games in the series. Since then, Suikoden has been suggested to me a number of times by another friend of the channel, Generation Pixel, and I've seen it pop up on so many best PS1 game lists. This was also during my 1 month of only playing original PlayStation games, and it just so happened that Nintendo announced the official release date for the long-awaited HD remaster of this game and its sequel. With those things, I finally decided to just sit down and give it a go. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and grab yourself a snack while we break the backlog on Suikoden for the original PlayStation. Suikoden is a turn-based RPG game in which the player takes on the role of a famous general's son who becomes embroiled in a conflict between the Liberation and the very empire his father fights for. It is a game whose themes are centered around friendship, making one's own destiny, and fighting for what's right even in the face of adversity, odds stacked against you, or at the cost of those you were once close to. Suikoden's lead writer and creator Yoshitaka Murayama began his work at Konami to develop their first ever home console. According to an interview he did with Time Extension, Murayama shared that this home console plan was scrapped earlier on, and the system was then to be made a handheld with 3D graphic capabilities that he described as a high-class Game Boy. This system was supposed to allow players to use a card reader to exchange data between games. An RPG for this console had also begun its very early stages of development, but both this and the console idea would be scrapped shortly after the announcement of the Sony PlayStation. After Sony's plans to enter the home console market were made public, Konami shifted their focus to developing games for the PlayStation. With this shift, both artist Junko Kamano and writer Yoshitaka Murayama were given a few choices of game concepts to start developing for the new Sony console. They began their work on a new RPG which would eventually become Suikoden, a story inspired in large part by a classic Chinese novel known as The Water Margin. The goal was to combine the action of video games with the structural narrative of a story like other JRPGs that had come before it had done, with Murayama citing Dragon Quest V in particular as being a massive help in understanding what made a good RPG at its core. However, Suikoden did step outside of its JRPG roots and expectations with a couple of key features that really set it apart from most of its counterparts. While there was still a focus on party-centered, turn-based combat, Suikoden took the usual count of recruitable characters and skyrocketed that number to the moon. Due to this, the focus of Suikoden's development became quite the feat, when it was decided that there would be a total of 108 characters that could be recruited into the rebellion. This meant that many of the team's development days were filled with brainstorming as many character ideas as they could, and I can only imagine the huge sigh of relief the development team took when they had just finished this massive roster of people. Another key inclusion into Suikoden's gameplay that we'll talk about a bit more in depth later in this video were times when the combat was not a turn-based party affair. What I will say is that these gameplay inclusions were just some of what made Suikoden such a special game. So now let's talk about what my experience and opinions were after playing this classic RPG. Suikoden's art style was actually what drew my interest initially, as I felt like the character sprites within the game really hold up well today. The character sprites are taller and closer to real body proportions than some of the other games of this era, and the 2D stylized graphics have aged incredibly well. Because of this, I really do think from a visual standpoint that Suikoden is more than just passable for 2024. Characters are each designed with vibrant palettes that help distinguish them from their fellow cast members, which I always find to be very visually appealing, and the way that character sprites and battle animations looked were aspects of this game that really placed it on my list of games I needed to finish even before I started playing it because of what I had seen from G.O.A.T's gameplay. Something else I found to be a really cool element of the art style was the unique inspiration from the Chinese literature piece that I mentioned earlier. This influence and inspiration is apparent in a lot of the clothing and armor depictions in this game, which I found to be a really cool variation on the usual European-centric armor and weapons we see in a lot of fantasy. Don't get me wrong, there's still armor and some swords that look like medieval European-centric things, and those are usually my favorite flavors of fantasy when the worlds are kind of set in those medieval European-centric settings. However, it was a really nice change of scenery to see a main character wielding a bow staff rather than a sword, as well as a long robe over his tunic that appeared to be inspired by the Qing Dynasty's Qi Pao. I found this to be a bit refreshing as I am not super familiar with Chinese history, and I feel like it isn't every day that we get that flavor injected into video games. And while these influences may extend to some of our characters, there is such a great variety in characters in the cast available that the world feels lived in and diverse. There's an entire tribe of warriors who name their blades and see this as a rite of passage into adulthood. There's a unique take on kobolds that you may have heard of in other fantasy universes, in which the usual scaly lizard folk are replaced by adorable race of doggos. And there's classic fantasy races here as well, like the ever-condescending elves and the craftsmen and weaponsmith dwarves who spend their lives at the forge or in the mines. The visuals for the characters have really held up just so beautifully over these years in my opinion, and this does extend to the battle animations as well during combat, which we'll talk about in a second. A lot of the way that Suikoden looks is carried by these fantastic sprites, though the character portraits also helped a great deal at keeping everyone straight at times. These portraits have aged a bit worse than the rest of the visuals for the game, though that isn't to say that they're downright terrible at all. The portraits are still distinguishable from each other and help to identify characters, and while I can't put my finger on what it was, once again, they're not poor quality necessarily. They just don't feel as pretty as the rest of the sprite work and character art styles that have really painted Suikoden as a game that has stood the test of time. Now, I said earlier we were going to talk about battle animations, which I found to be very visually impressive for the time. Specifically, the rune-based magic attacks, or the skill moves, were just a treat, and upon unlocking a new level of a rune, I would be excited to pick a fight with the first boar that I could find, just so I got a chance to watch a character send it to the Shadow Realm. The runes range from all sorts of elemental magic to some larger-than-life physical attack moves that really are of high quality considering how old this title is. Characters leap across the battlefield to slash and stab at each other, while the battlefield is also littered with ranged weapons and spells being hurled from either side. I think that overall, from a character standpoint, I absolutely love the sprite work in this game, and I found that it has stood the test of time and looked really good today. From the unique and vibrant palettes to the fairly smooth attack animations, the characters bring a lot of life and charm to this title. As far as the enemies, there are quite a few of them, though admittedly a lot of them are just recolors of a base unit that are meant to be stronger. Most of these sprites do a fine job of providing the party with punching bags to take down, though in specific, the bosses in particular are where many of the more interesting and visually impressive fights take place. The locales that make up this world are also as varied as its inhabitants, and the adventure sees the party cover everything from a large sprawling city to a small abandoned ghost town that are all a part of an explorable world, which help the world feel like it's a lived-in place. Each have their own unique swatch of colors used in their design, as well as denizens who have different overall attitudes towards the political world of the game. Seeing these differences in the world's inhabitants made it really interesting to enter a town and catch up with the residents to learn more about the world. From elves who think they're better than everyone, to humans who remain ever loyal to the empire you're fighting against, there are a ton of variety in the townsfolk. Overall, from a visual standpoint, Suikoden is still a game whose art style is really easy to digest and enjoy, as the sprite work has remained enjoyable throughout the years. The vibrant, colorful, and massive cast of characters, the world and its unique inhabitants and locations, and the solid battle style and animations make for a visual package that's still enjoyable nearly 30 years later. From a sound standpoint, things are solid as well. There are some different sounds for attacks, whether it be the swipe of a sword, the throwing of a spear, or the casting of magic, which all do a pretty serviceable job in filling the soundscape of battle with life. The soundtrack of Suikoden is really good, however, and this is where most of that injection of life comes from, as there's no voice acting in this game. The music is your ever-present companion throughout the game's narrative, and it does a wonderful job in providing whimsical songs of adventure and heroism, sinister refrains of betrayal and schemes, and beautiful tracks that follow the story of friends, allies, losses, and resilience. This game's music is stellar, and I always found that the scenes in which pieces were used really always added to the emotional vibe of the story in that given part. I actually found the lack of voice scenes made the music stand out that much more and made it that much more important, and it was really able to carry the emotional weight of the narrative very successfully due to its high quality and the thoughtfulness in creating a soundtrack like this. The gameplay of Suikoden is centered around many of the JRPG staples of the time that it was released in. Players can expect to travel on an overworld map where random encounters stand between them and the next area to be explored. Battles in the game are turn-based affairs in which characters are given commands to basic attack, use magic or special moves, use items, run, or defend. The combat here is fairly fast-paced as well, as the party does consist of 6 members like I mentioned earlier. This means that a lot of damage is being thrown around, so once proper leveling for any given area has been achieved, most fights don't last very long. And it feels like Suikoden does these JRPG mainstays exceedingly well, with them finding a really good balance between me not drowning in a million random encounters, but also making it where early fights in each new region are a bit challenging. I also found that much like in my on-again, off-again playthrough of Trails of the Sky first chapter, having to rely on ends gives a coziness to these JRPGs that really does make sense given the context of the game's scope and the journey that our heroes are on. Having to check in at ends to save your game may just be a bit of role-playing for me, but I really enjoyed picturing my characters in this massive journey all over this continent and having to stop off and rest at ends to replenish and record their travels before moving on. So we've established that Suikoden has built itself on a strong foundation of ever-present and classic JRPG mechanics, but it also does well in many of the other new or not-so-common mechanics that it brings to the table. Like I said earlier, one of the main pillars of Suikoden's narrative is stepping outside of the shadows cast by those who came before you. Like our character does with that of his father's name and achievements, so too does Suikoden as a video game set out to carve a unique path of its own with some of its gameplay elements. This was firstly achieved through its painstakingly massive cast of recruitable characters. Just knowing how big of a stressor this was to the team makes me appreciate the effort that it must have taken to create over 100 characters with unique personalities, weapons, attack styles, and conditions for recruiting that I can't even begin to imagine how stretched the collective imagination and creative of the team had to become by the end of this development cycle. But there are even more gameplay mechanics included with Suikoden that carry this sense of originality. One such inclusion is the weapon system, in which characters don't find or buy new weapons on their travels. Instead, heroes come with one weapon, and this weapon can be improved upon through visiting the blacksmiths within the game. This allows characters to continue to sharpen their weapon through various levels, which sometimes gives the weapon a new name. This was another cool bit of world building, as there was an incentive to stop in towns that have blacksmiths, because not all of them do, and take advantage of their services when you come across them. That is, unless there was a way to recruit a blacksmith of your own, maybe. But yeah, there are other shops and craftsmen like this, like ones that inspect treasures you find and identify what they are, or another that can attach and remove runes from characters. There's also recruitable shopkeepers for the Rebellion whose inventories will grow every time you visit a new shop within the game, which really gives you an incentive to walk around towns and talk to people. Another one of Suikoden's more unique takes on the genre is its attempt to bring new takes to combat seen throughout the game. These take two different forms, with battles between armies as well as duels that take place between characters in a one-on-one showdown. The former acts as a rock, paper, scissors sort of minigame in which players act as the commanding officer of the Liberation and make decisions on how to approach combat to crush enemy forces. Recruiting the 108 Stars of Destiny will put them into squads based on their ties with each other or their kind of combat roles, and these squads have some different functions. Attack squads consist of damage dealers who largely dish out melee attack weapon damage, whereas the other two main categories in magic and bow and arrow are ranged and a bit more self-explanatory. Then there's also this fourth category that contains different units like thieves and ninjas who can predict what the enemy's next move will be, as well as others like the merchant who will do their best to turn the enemy forces against their brothers in arms and bolster those of the Liberation. This system, while simplistic, does a wonderful job in emulating the decision making that is required to lead an army to victory. I also found that the stakes of these skirmishes can be rather high, especially early on in the game when predicting the enemy's moves is much harder to do because the various Stars of Destiny can actually die in combat if their unit loses a battle. This really caught me off guard as I sent out a husband and wife duo just for the wife to be taken down in the battle that ensued. It gave me a Fire Emblem kind of vibes, and I really liked the permadeath in those games, as it adds more tension to the fights. This system was really neat, and I thought it was a really unique spin on the classic JRPG genre that fit the flavor and plot of this game. The duels are less common, at least in my experience, though they are two sort of centered around the rock, paper, scissors sort of system. Combatants both select from choices that include attack, defend, and desperate attack, which all counter each other in some way. Attacks can still break through defense, though it does do less damage. Defense deals a massive counterattack in response to a desperate attack, and desperate attack does a large chunk of damage while trading blows with a normal attack. These duels are pretty intense, and it's only through learning the opponent's callouts that they yell across the battlefield to you that a player can try to piece together the pattern to respond to. These two additions to the combat were welcome ones in that they offer a twist on the usual turn-based RPG combat that fits both the story and setting of the title. The gameplay here is super solid, with fights feeling fast and fluid while still offering some chances at strategy with the big boss fights. Magic becomes super powerful as characters grow into their abilities and find access to new runes. Weapons need constant attention and sharpening to keep them in tip-top shape, and saving frequently means resting at ends and taking full advantage of what towns had to offer. I felt like a weary traveler myself in many of these cases when I just needed to get to the next town so I could save so I could go to bed. This is a case of a game that has great RPG systems that only exist to increase the engagement with the narrative, and for that I feel like the gameplay as a whole is really well done and offered a fun experience for the entirety of the 16 hours I played this game. Suikoden is super fun, and you should give it a chance if you haven't. We have another story of rebellion, my little Plupa troops, so why don't we gather around the fire and talk about what Suikoden is all about. As always, I'm going to do my best not to spoil too much of the game's story, especially since this game's remaster or remake is due early next year, and as such, we're only going to be talking about the early setup of the narrative and the overall story in a general sense. Suikoden sees us take the role of the young teenage son of a famous Imperial general named Teo McDole as he comes to age in this time where tensions are rising and an all-out war seems unavoidable. When Teo is called away, our hero is left in the caring hands of the friends of the family who have been around for much of his life that were fiercely loyal to his father, Cleo, Pon, and Grumio, as well as the main character's longtime friend Ted. Our young hero enrolls in the Imperial Army and sets out from his home of Gregminster to live up to the McDole name. It isn't long though before our party sees just how corrupt the world outside of Gregminster is under the boot of the Empire. This would eventually culminate in the player character and the party being ruthlessly hunted as the Empire turns on the party due to their connection to the Soul Eater rune, one of the legendary true runes that has been sought after by government officials for years. This rune is given to our hero, and after making a run for it, the party become fugitives in a world that they once called home. Our heroes, once loyal subjects of the Empire, are now hunted down by the very armors they aspired to be a part of, which leads the party into the hands of the Liberation Army. The hero learns that he has to step out of the shadow of his father's name and become a hero of his own story. After certain events take place, he becomes the head of the Liberation Army and is tasked with recruiting the 108 Stars of Destiny to wage an all-out war on the corrupt Empire to make a better future for everyone in the known world. And that is pretty much all of the story we're going to talk about today. This game's narrative was one that quickly snatched all of my attention in the early days of my PS1 only for a month challenge, and it was largely all I played until I beat it. It's just a really well crafted narrative that features plot points covering a variety of different themes that all tie in with the cruel reality of war. I liked that this game didn't pull any punches with the narrative, and it wasn't afraid to kill characters off when it made sense to do so, based on what that death meant for the narrative and the surviving characters. While it has become more frequent for fantasy-based media to kill off its cast, there are still many times in fantasy stories where the creators of these stories will hesitate to permanently kill their characters. This is something that, while I understand, doesn't really do a whole lot for me as a consumer of fantasy content. There's nothing like the stress, weight, and emotional cost that a character death wreaks on the surviving cast. Luckily for Suikoden, at its core game, it does a great job of displaying the horrors of war, and I think that the story is all the better for it. Characters do die, and there's plenty of time and subsequent scenes and references to these deaths that give them meaning. The narrative also focuses a lot of its time on what it means to be a leader, trusting in your allies and carving a path of your own outside of the achievements of those who came before you. All of these themes come through brilliantly and make for a story that never lingers too long and whose pacing feels fast enough to keep players engaged, yet careful enough to not rush through all of the emotional story beats. All in all, the story is both extremely well done and well thought out, and it covers a lot of ground despite it only taking just over 16 hours for me to complete. Suikoden is an excellent game that offers a lot of surprising depth in its mechanics for a game that is as old as it is. I'm happy that I listened to my YouTube buddies and I finally got around to this game because it's as good as they all praised it to be. I enjoyed the overall story of this game and felt like it really didn't hold back when it came to making emotional moments for us players to experience. From its really fluid combat system to its dedication to combining both RPG tropes and also adding its own identity to the game, Suikoden is an absolute blast. This is yet another retro title that has stood the test of time and still really offers a fun experience, even nearly 30 years later. Have you played Suikoden on the original PlayStation, or are you waiting for the remasters to come out? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me and your patience throughout the break, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure you like and subscribe. And until next time, take care of yourselves. Peace.